Hello, it's week 23 of season 4 of the Andy Griffith Show. This week's episode title is Andy Saves Gomer. Barney, you're not in this episode, are you?
No, I'm taking that week off that Andy gave me in the last episode. My cousin Virgil and I have gone up to the Y in Raleigh. And I had written Andy a letter about all the fun we're having, and Andy and Floyd read it to Ultie in the courthouse. And then Andy takes the letter over to show Gomer at Wally's filling station. But Andy finds Gomer asleep while some oily rags are burning in a trash can, and Andy wakes Gomer up and puts out the fire.
And Gomer says Andy saved his life. And Andy says, oh, it was nothing. So Gomer offers him all this free gas and oil and a lube job and all kinds of car parts in return for Andy saving his life. And Andy says no and leaves.
And then Gomer comes to Andy's house the next morning while they're having breakfast, and he brings them a bunch of fish that he just caught. He says it's little enough for the man that just saved his life. And Gomer tells a real exaggerated version of the story to Ultie and to Aunt Dee, and then he says he washed and waxed the patrol car too. And then Gomer offers to do all these other chores, and Andy leaves the house and takes Ultie with him just to get away from Gomer.
And then Gomer comes down to the courthouse later that day and brings Andy's galoshes and umbrella because he says it might rain later that day. And he wants to do all these chores around the courthouse too. And Andy says no and has to push him out.
But Gomer comes over later anyway and starts washing the courthouse windows from outside. And Andy goes out to tell him to stop, but Gomer starts telling folks on the street the exaggerated story of Andy saving his life. And that night Andy comes home to see that Gomer has stacked enough firewood for 7 winters. And he wants to do more chores, and Andy has to tush him out again. And Aunt Dee says Gomer insisted on straightening up their attic, and it took her an hour to get things back to where she can find them again.
And then Andy goes down to the fire hall, or starts to go down to the fire hall for a supper and a cribbage game that some of the boys are having. And he leaves through the back door to avoid Gomer, but Gomer intercepts him anyway and offers to take him to that same supper.
So Andy changes his mind about going, and before Gomer leaves, he says he intends to die Andy's side to help him out for the rest of his life. And the next morning Gomer cuts Andy's grass, and he trims his hedges. And then he starts hanging around Ultie also, helping him with everything and embarrassing him in front of his friends. And then Gomer tries to help Aunt Dee make a cake, and he just gets in the way more than he helps.
So Andy and Aunt Bee and Opie have to have supper in the jail cell that night behind a curtain to hide from Gomer. And then Andy starts to fix a broken gas heater pipe in the courthouse, and he gets an idea.
He calls his house, and Gomer is still there, and he asks Gomer to bring him his jacket, and then he releases some gas from the pipe in the courthouse so Gomer can smell it when he comes in and he can rescue Andy. But first, Ultie needs Andy outside, so when Gomer comes in, he smells the gas and tries to adjust the pipe, and then he falls over from the gas. And then Andy comes in and turns off the gas, and he acts like he had already passed out also, and had then crawled from behind the desk. And he convinces Gomer that Gomer was the one that now saved Andy's life, and that now they're even. And then Aunt Dee comes in, and this time Andy tells an exaggerated story of how brave Gomer was.
But the next morning, Gomer comes to the house again while they're having breakfast, and he says he decided that the gas incident was proof that Andy is accident prone and still needs Gomer's help every day. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week for episode 24.